All right, folks. So on to chapter 11 now. Chapter 11, as you can see, deals with the broad topics of evolution and how evolution works. I kind of want to start out by just mentioning one thing because there are topics in life that people get really passionate about or get angry about. You start talking about things like abortion, for example, that really can hit people in different ways, and people can take a sort of a religious or biblical perspective or anything else, and there probably are not a lot of other topics that can also draw a similar sort of getting people worked up or fired up than talking about evolution. So one thing I want to kind of start with here is, remember, this is a biology class, a science course, and evolution is a fundamental principle, a fundamental theory, or what we now consider to be a law, although again, laws in science can be changed. And so everything in science really builds upon evolution, which is, again, just sort of the process of things changing over time, living things adapting to their environment and either changing and being more suited to their environment, or if species aren't able to adapt, then potentially they go extinct. And so this is a process that has led to all of the diversity that we have on the earth, from the microscopic bacteria to the largest living things like the redwoods, or the largest living animals like the blue whale. So all diversity of life on the earth is a result of evolution. And again, it's a ongoing process. Species, including humans, continue to evolve today. One of the challenges, I think, is that sometimes people, well, there's several issues, but sometimes people think that we shouldn't be teaching evolution unless we teach creation. Well, again, this is science. This is about a very important theory in science, whereas creation is faith-based. And so these are not things that are really meant to be covered in, both are not meant things to be covered in science classes. Also, my point isn't to, if you have a strong faith and you believe in creation and God, which I believe in, by the way, as well, the point isn't to try and convince you you're wrong. It's just to try and show what evidence science has used to believe that evolution is the process that guides how living things evolve and change over time. So again, my point isn't to try and change people's minds or convince them, that if they believe in God, that they're wrong. There's there are a lot of scientists who believe in God, obviously, or maybe you didn't know that, and I am one of them, by the way. And there, as a scientist and someone who's been trained all their life to look for evidence in making, decisions about things, whether it's from a scientific standpoint or whether it's just stuff you see and read on TV. It was one of those struggles, how to kind of come to terms with believing in God and having read the Bible more than once from cover to cover, and going to church at some point in my life, and trying to reconcile the idea that you can believe in God, but also that there's evidence that I believe is strong and obvious to support the theory of evolution. And so I almost wish I'd coined this, because I'm probably not the first person to think of this, but I was the first When I thought of this and thought of a way to describe it, it was the first time I had heard anybody say it this way, but I've come to find out that a lot of scientists believe in a similar thing to the way I believe it happens. So again, I believe in God, but my thought, or again, the way I come to terms with balancing believing in God and believing in science and evolution, is the idea that the very first life forms were simple, relatively simple, single-celled organisms. And again, following the evidence of evolution, life began on the planet 4.5 billion years ago as these single-celled life forms, and then given a very, very long time, which is also a concept that's impossible for humans to put in perspective. We're alive for 100 years if we're really, really lucky. To picture how billions of years can influence life is impossible. But in my mind, why isn't it possible that God created the first life? Because there's always that argument, well, how did life start from nothing? Something can't come from nothing. How can life begin from organic molecules that aren't alive? And there are theories about that, but the way I've reconciled it is maybe God created those life forms, those single-celled organisms, and we know the universe is predictable. It has order and organization. If I take a tennis ball and I were to throw it across my classroom at someone in the back of the room, and I got relatively good aim, I suppose, I can predict how hard and how high I have to lob the ball to get it to go to someone I'm trying to throw it to. And I can do that because gravity, for example, is predictable. I don't have to worry about, if I throw a ball, is today going to be the day it randomly goes shooting off to the left? Or as soon as I let go of it, it goes shooting up to the moon. I know that's not going to happen. It's a predictable pattern. And so, again, why isn't it possible that God created the life, gave it all the instructions and directions to follow, the guidelines for life to follow, and then just sort of set it loose to do its thing? Maybe you can throw in there that, it's God's will guiding how things became what they are, which is sort of the same thing I'm saying. If God was the architect and built stuff and then kind of gave them instructions on how to exist and evolve and change over time to what we see today, in my mind, that's a plausible solution. Do I know it's the right one? No. Do I know it's the only one? Of course not. No human on this planet does. But for me as a scientist, that's how I've reconciled what some people see as completely conflicting ideas. Something that's based on belief, as in creationism, versus something that's based on evidence or science. And so that's just how I've come to reconcile it. And when I say earlier about patenting something, I call it creative evolution. I've heard other people refer to that general belief as that. Creative evolution, meaning, God created life, but gave it instructions to evolve over time. So I'm also not saying that you have to believe that, of course, but I'm just giving you my background so that you can sort of understand where I'm coming from. I've been to church quite a bit, not recently, but when I was in Texas and Arizona, I was going to a sort of a traditional Southern Baptist church, and so studied the Bible, and I did read. I do literally mean I read the Bible cover to cover more than one time. And that was even the scientist in me. You really can't make a good argument or debate about something unless you understand both sides a little bit, right? And what I see, and from both sides is, and I saw this with the pastor. I love the guy to death, and that I went to in Arizona, but he was just not interested in hearing anything about evolution. And I tried to have, intelligent discussions with him at times, and his belief was so strong, which you might expect from a pastor, but it also blinded him a little bit in that he wasn't willing to sort of hear my side of the story. And so all I would ask is, and not just about this, but anything in life, that before you judge it or think you can speak to it, you have to really understand both sides. And again, maybe this is the scientist in me, gather data, look at the data, interpret it, follow basically the scientific method in a way. And I'm not talking about applying that to the Bible directly, but as far as, understand the Bible and then understand the other side, the science, and then make an informed decision. And if that is still where you don't believe there's evidence for evolution, then that's fine. That's what you believe. I'll still argue that there is evidence that supports evolution, but at least make sure you're open-minded and that you study both sides and then go from there and realize nobody knows, right? There's so many different religions on the planet, and they all believe their perspective is the correct one. And they may all be correct, or none of them may be reality. There might be multiple gods. There might not be any God. We'll all know at some point after we're no longer on this planet. But again, just to give you a little background, kind of where I'm coming from, so you understand that perspective. And so in this class, then, what we're going to focus on is the what evolution is, how we believe it works, the evidence that supports what science is basing everything on, and just trying to tie it all together to understand how important the concept of evolution is, the theory of evolution is, with respect to the foundation of science. You have to have a good foundation for anything in life, right? If you're going to build a house, you can't have a crappy foundation made out of rotting wood or bad concrete or whatever and expect the house to last. You also don't want to keep trying to build a foundation that's crappy and have to tear the house down just to redo the foundation every 5 years. You want to build a good solid foundation, and that's again what the root of science is. And I'm not just talking about evolution again. All science. Theories are built by lots and lots of scientists following the scientific method, gathering data, interpreting it, building on it, and then eventually when you've got enough evidence supporting an idea, it becomes a theory. And then that theory is the foundation that you can build upon. And so evolution is a foundational theory in all of science. And we go back to Charles Darwin, typically is the person we think of who developed the theory of evolution, or tested it and eventually led to the theory of evolution. But Alfred Wallace, pictured on the right, also wrote papers on natural selection, and they were actually presented at the same scientific meeting back in 1858. And they both had gathered similar data that supported the similar hypotheses. Darwin got a little bit luckier in that he was part of a voyage on a ship called the Beagle, and that ship happened to, among other places, go to the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin, because he was already studying this idea of how things change over time, which again led to ultimately the theory of evolution, he stumbled on these Galapagos Islands and was able to make a lot of really good data collection and observations about the species that lived on those islands. From island to island, he would notice things that were species that were similar to each other, but yet a little different. there were several different species of Galapagos tortoises, land tortoises, that were all obviously tortoises, but they were different sizes from each other. They had different shapes, different shell. Their carapace, their top shell was slightly different. Maybe even more significantly, he observed a bunch of species of birds that were all related called finches. And they were different from island to island, similar but different, adapted to different conditions on different islands. And so with a little bit of luck and certainly a lot of skill, he proposed the mechanism of evolution in a book called On the Origin of Species by the Means of Natural Selection. I've also read that book cover to cover, but only one time. It was almost harder to read than the Bible in a lot of ways. Old English written, style and so forth. But another book that probably you should read if you're reading the Bible. Just another counter argument. Although again, I wouldn't say it's exactly counter, but the scientific side of providing evidence for why we believe evolution is the thing that describes how species change over time. And certainly, again, a big part of his evidence was that the environment must play a crucial role in deciding which characteristics or traits are inherited from parents to their offspring. And ultimately, it's that cumulative genetic change, not in individuals, but in the species as a whole, meaning the population of a given species. And if those traits are passed along from one generation to the next, and if and only if those characteristics are actually beneficial to that species, will it then allow that species to be more successful in their efforts to survive and reproduce and then further pass their genetics on from one generation to the next. So the process of evolution through natural selection involves adaptations and modifications that improve the chance of survival, which ultimately improve your chance to reproduce. And we refer to this generally as fitness. If we talk about how fit a human is, we generally think of strength, being able to do push-ups and pull-ups and run fast. In a species, it means something much, much broader. It means survival and reproduction. If you can survive and reproduce, which is really all species are about, all living things on this planet really only have two purposes: to survive and to reproduce, carry on their gene pool. And so there are a number of things we're going to talk a little bit about that help guide natural selection. Again, ultimately it's guided by the environment. The environment really sort of pushes back against living things, sort of challenges them to adapt to this or die, adapt to these dry conditions, adapt to this heat, adapt to all this snow, adapt to all of these other things that want to eat you, find a way not to get eaten. And if that happens, then you can produce more young. And unfortunately, we think of this from a human perspective, but in nature, it's all about making way more babies than you know will possibly survive. It's almost like flood the market so that not everyone can get eaten. And because we know that, it could be as little as, a few percent of every living thing that's born. It may only be 1 or 2 out of every 100 that survive long enough to be adults and then make their own babies. So living things have evolved, generally speaking, the ability or the need to make way more babies than can possibly survive, just so enough of them do survive. Competition also plays a big role. You're competing with your brothers and sisters to get enough food and everything else you need. But you're also competing with every other living thing in your area, within your environment. There are a lot of living things that have similar food sources, and there isn't always or usually enough to feed everything. So you got to be faster, stronger, better eyesight, better camouflage, whatever it might be. You got to be better adapted to that environment, competing against other living things to get enough resources for yourself to survive. Fundamentally, though, it's also about genetic variation. Previous chapters, we talk about mitosis and meiosis, sexual reproduction via meiosis, and how genes are kind of shifted around and reassigned to the offspring, and that creates variation, and that variation is key for evolution, along with the fact that individuals that reproduce sexually, where that genetic variation is created, as opposed to simply asexual reproduction, where you're just making copies, identical copies of yourself. Sexual reproduction has allowed species to become more diverse and better adapted. And then ultimately that genetic variation, though, is all about those random mutations that happen. Again, we did talk about this as well in the previous couple chapters ago about how mutations occur, but also that those mutations are usually not good. Usually those mutations result in changes that don't aid survival. They usually result in earlier death. But on that relatively rare occasion when the mutation is something beneficial, slightly different color, maybe that color is a little more like your background so you can hide better, maybe it's slightly better eyesight, whatever it might be. But on those rare occasions where the mutations are good, they provide benefits to that species' survival. When we first started talking about Darwin, I mentioned that one of the fortunate or lucky things that he stumbled upon were, while on the Galapagos Islands, these numerous species of finch-like birds that existed on all the different islands that were separated from each other by open water. Obviously, birds can fly, but these islands were far enough apart that there weren't a lot of instances of the different species on the different islands actually going back and forth between islands. And so what that did is it led to the evolution of these finches to have a variety of different characteristics. There were finches from the number one up there that oops, hang on a second here. So sorry about that. So from the example up there, where you see this finch has a really what we would call a robust beak, a large, heavy, triangular beak. And that all involves what type of food these species actually eat. And so any bird that has a really stout beak is meant for breaking heavy seeds or nuts, getting at the fruit that's inside of the hard outer shells. Some of the finches had somewhat medium-sized beaks, maybe smaller-sized seeds. Some have longer, pointier beaks, which allow them to kind of reach down into little cracks and crevices, maybe to get at bugs that are down deep inside the bark of trees. And then even these little short, stubby beaks that allow these types of finches to be able to eat small little insects off of the surface of a leaf, for example. And these are just 4 examples of these Galapagos finches, but as he went from island to island, he not only found finches that had different types of beaks that allowed them to eat different types of foods, but he found some that basically fed on the ground, others that were up in the tops of the trees, others that hung around more up against the stems of the trees. And basically, again, showing examples of a species that evolved all sorts of different ecological niches. But ultimately what this means is they were evolving because they were competing with each other, and they were evolving different features that allowed them to minimize the competition they had with each other, minimize the amount of competition so that they could adapt to different types of foods and conditions, and ultimately that was meant to enhance their survival. Since Darwin's time, there have been a lot of scientists, as you might imagine, that have continued studying the Galapagos Islands, studying things like the species of finches on the island. And one kind of unique research project happened to be going on when there was a drought that hit, a really severe drought. And the scientists were actually able, and they'd been researching on that island for decades, to actually see a little sort of mini evolution happening in response to the environment changing. In other words, a drought. The one particular island they were studying, the island called Daphne Major, had a lot less species of plants that provided the really small seeds because of the drought. And that small seed source wasn't nearly as available because of the drought. And so it caused a lot of the small beaked finches to die off. Because again, they had evolved and adapted to survive on those small seeds. As that plant became less abundant, the species started dying off, as you'd imagine. If there aren't enough food sources, many of them are going to die off. But what this actually happened to result in was that the average size of the beak of the finch actually increased between the couple of years immediately during and following the drought. So it was almost an immediate response, sort of microevolution, an immediate response to the change in the food source. So again, species adaptation to the ever-changing environment. I think the link here that says beak shape is actually the link to the little short YouTube video about that research project that a husband and wife biology team actually had done during that time. So again, even today, 150 plus years after Darwin, scientists are still studying evolution or examples of natural selection with the idea that more and more data, more and more evidence is either going to continue to support the theory of evolution, or, and this is certainly possible, that, future research may show or may identify a different mechanism for evolution. But again, as of right now, the evidence continues to support the theory that we're talking about. So keep in mind that you have to have a genetic basis to lead to change. If the random mutations or the gene pool doesn't have sort of the capacity to allow for some genetic change, then there won't be any change in future generations. So that genetic change, again, whether it happens through mutations or genes that are there but they're not expressing themselves, but again, only that variation is only going to stay in the gene pool if it helps, if there's some benefit for it to be there. Just to have a bunch of random colors of something won't happen unless there's a benefit. Typically when you have different colors, different patterns in a species, it's because these species are in habitats that look different. If giraffe only occurred in one type of habitat, there would be no reason for them to have different colors and patterns. But if they exist across a variety of habitats with different types of plants that are different colors, different shapes, different sizes, and you're an animal that's a prey species, you get eaten by other things, then the evolution of these different colors and patterns has a benefit to your actual survival, and therefore those changes then could persist on into the future. So again, it's this genetic diversity created by evolution over billions of years that lead to the diversity of life on the planet. Genetic diversity leads to the sort of macro diversity of species. And there are two basic sources. Again, we already talked about mutation, so that random change in DNA during the process of meiosis can affect the phenotype. You know, it can affect how something looks. The zebra that we were just looking at. These are all things called ladybugs or lady beetles, I guess, depending on which way you want to think about these things being called. And yet you can see lots of different patterns and colors in these ladybugs. And again, that wouldn't have just happened were there not a reason or a benefit to the ladybugs for that happening. Generally, though, again, mutations are not good. Generally, they reduce fitness. They don't help, they reduce fitness. But occasionally, they do produce a beneficial phenotype. They do produce some sort of benefit. Or, obviously, the third option is that whatever that mutation is, it could be neutral. It might not help their survival. It might not hurt their survival. It's just a random change, and it's neutral. It just maybe stays in the gene pool for no other reason than it didn't help, it didn't hurt. But then also, of course, sexual reproduction is a key to the whole process of evolution. We talked about what happens during crossing over, during meiosis. We talked about how that creates these unique combinations of alleles from a shuffling from the two parents' DNA. And because of sexual reproduction, you can get all of these different combinations. Again, going from the original dog, which was the wolf, to all of these domestic varieties, any of which can interbreed with any other one. But yet, wolves can be there can be a little variation, right? I mean, you may have seen wolves that are pretty much white, the typical looking color pattern, and then wolves that are pretty much pure black. But they all still look like a wolf. Dogs can not only be different colors, but different sizes, different body styles, different temperaments. And again, all that is possible because of sexual reproduction and having all of these allele combinations that we as humans have actually artificially bred. Instead of letting natural evolution take place over millions of years, we've sort of forced these changes to happen over, a few hundred years, primarily. So again, ultimately, an important concept behind evolution is adaptation, fitness to the environment, matching an organism to its environment. And again, whatever the trait is that appears, how favorable it is going to depend on the environment. If you're a polar bear and you're living in what's now South Florida, you're going to die unless you're in a zoo and you're protected and you've got nice cold water. they've evolved big, stout bodies, certain type of fur, hair that allows them to keep warm. And they don't really do that well when the temperatures even are warmer in the summers sometimes up in Alaska and Canada, the Arctic Circle and so forth where they exist. They don't even do well when it gets, above freezing because they're engineered to live in a very, very cold climate. It's also why we're really concerned that polar bears might ultimately be doomed if climate change continues to happen. But we'll save that discussion for a little later in the semester. Remember also, though, that the climate changes. Not even talking about humans, just evolutionary history. Climates have changed and they will continue to change. Today we might think that humans are speeding up some changes faster than they would have happened naturally. But regardless, climates change. And so then do species adapt to that change? And those that do continue to survive. Those that are unable to adapt to the changes ultimately go extinct. And we've seen that process repeated billions of times on this planet. Just like dogs have all been sort of evolved from a common ancestor, flowering plants, any plant that makes a flower, evolved from common ancestors. These two plants that your book chose look different from each other. They have very different types of flowers. I mean, obvious things like color and all that, but if you were to look at the anatomy of these two flowers in, say, a botany course, you'd identify the same or many of the same structures, but that they've evolved to maybe be very different. So again, even though they may look different, when you dissect them, they have petals and stamens and all the other parts that every other flowering plant does. If things have differences but yet some core similarities, that would tend to be evidence that things, even if they look different, evolved from a common ancestor at some point in their evolutionary history. This is one of the things that that people sometimes use as evidence why humans were created strictly by, well, that all life, I guess, in general, but evidence that humans didn't evolve from apes, which we didn't, by the way, or that we didn't evolve from fish, which we didn't, by the way. All animals, whether you're a human or a porpoise, or even less so a snake, or even less so a fish, evolved from a common ancestor, but not directly from each other. And that's kind of a pretty different thing, but it is hard to get that concept. Again, humans have trouble with space and time. We don't, and it's easy to understand. It's hard for us to imagine time in thousands of years, much less millions or billions of years, and what can happen in that amount of time. Given a long time, we get the evolution occurring, and that's why it's so difficult to really understand it, I think, a lot of times. So again, we base our processes that we understand of evolution on evidence. And so we observe patterns in nature, in current living things, and in the fossils from the past, where we can see a couple of different ways that evolution has happened, patterns of evolution. We have the idea of divergent evolution, where you have a species, a parent species, and given enough time, and then species being spatially separated from each other, separated by oceans, separated on islands from each other like the Darwin's finches, separated by mountain ranges like the Rocky Mountains, species on one side or the other of the mountain range over time. continents separating and moving away from each other result in different climates, different habitats, different plants, and then the species that depend on those climates, habitats, plants. Um, Again, if they survive, it's because they adapt to the changes. And if the one species now is subject to two different climates or habitats or predators or whatever, they have to adapt to those differences, which generally means they're going to diverge away from each other. Could be the way they look, the type of food they eat, mechanisms of camouflaging themselves. It could be any number of things, but basically that's the idea of divergent evolution. One parent species getting separated over time, space, and then those changes in the conditions they're exposed to cause them to adapt, which usually means they diverge or become different from each other. Conversely, you can have convergent evolution, where you have two things that are unrelated to each other, two different species. And yet, if they're now subject to the same conditions as each other, again, maybe in the past they were in different habitats, different conditions, but as those species maybe ended up showing up in the same area at the same time, now they're both exposed to the same conditions. And if you're two predators, you're about the same size, that kind of thing, you're probably going to have a lot of the same food sources, or you're going to have to deal with the same conditions. And so a lot of times that results in species becoming a little more similar to each other, converging, and maybe even eventually converging into becoming one new species instead of two separate species. And then C here, letter C, is parallel evolution, where you have two species that are evolving kind of side by side. It's almost like they're literally in a drag race with each other. A lot of times parallel evolution occurs in a species of a predator, say like a mountain lion, and a prey species like a black-tailed deer we have in California. The prey species wants to survive, so they evolve, longer legs to run, better eyesight, better hearing, camouflage colors to hide from the predators. And if that worked 100% of the time, the mountain lion would go extinct. Conversely, if the mountain lion evolved better eyesight, better hearing, it was quicker, it could sneak up on a prey item, and every time it went hunting, it killed a deer, the deer would probably go extinct. So both species are evolving kind of side by side in a race against each other to be able to, find enough food and survive and make babies. And so they continue side by side, sort of evolving with each other, pushing each other to evolve for the benefit of themselves to try and survive. So make sure you understand those three patterns of evolution. And then we're also going to talk about this a little more, but other ways we look at evolution is by the anatomy of the things. We look at ways to determine how related something is. Of course, again, today we have genetics. We have the ability to do genetic profiles on living things and figure out exactly how closely related they are. But even before we had that, back in Darwin's day, you would simply look at anatomy and look at analogous structures on living things, as well as homolog or homologous structures on living things. You look at things like the body shape. These are all species of living things. The shark, get rid of that for a minute. Sorry here. Sometimes this computer has a little bit of a mind of its own. So let me get my pen back here. Well, sorry, hang on here. Let me go back to the slide view, and I'll just go without my pointer for the moment. So you have things like body shapes. These are all things, again, that live in the water. A fish like a shark. You can see it kind of has a pointed nose, goes to a wider body, and then back to a tail. We call that a fusiform shape. But also extinct reptiles like the ichthyosaur has that same general body shape. Birds like penguins that are primarily aquatic, same body shape, as do mammals that have the aquatic lifestyle. But also for propelling these things through the water, they have fins. In the case, again, of the mammal, the fin, which would have been a forelimb, a front limb, the bones are shortened and fused to make a flipper. Same thing with the bird. Instead of it being a long feathered wing that the bird can, spread out and have individual feathers, now it's fused together, and the bird basically flies through the water. And then, of course, the normal sort of fish shape there. But even beyond, just beyond the sort of superficial similarities in anatomy, you look internally, and all four of these living things have the exact same bones. They all have the humerus, which is our upper arm bone. They have the radius and ulna, which make up the forearm or forelimb. They have the carpals and metacarpals and phalanges. But when you look at those bones, they all are different sizes and shapes. They've evolved into a different structure than most of their ancestors. Again, the dolphin, which is a mammal just like us, doesn't have a forearm anymore, doesn't have fingers or toes. They have a flipper, but they still have all the same bones in their arm and hand as we do. We look at this process of divergent evolution, and there's probably no better place in the world than Australia to look at. You have all of these examples of a category of animal called a marsupial. They give live birth, but they all have pouches. Their fetus is kind of born twice. First it's born, and then it crawls in the pouch, grabs on, and continues to nurse and develop and grow. And then it's kind of born again, and still maybe lives part of its juvenile life in the pouch, a place the parent can protect it. But in Australia, you've got sort of the equivalent. The kangaroo on the top there is the equivalent to, say, our deer, sort of a larger grazing animal. You've got the Dasyurus to the left at like 11 o'clock, the cat equivalent, but still a marsupial. The koala, the flying phalanger, which is kind of like our tree squirrels. The anteater, they've got marsupial mice, wombats, moles that are marsupials, the wolf, the Tasmanian wolf, which may or may not be extinct. That is the marsupial equivalent to canines that the rest of the world has. So these original marsupials evolved or diverged into all of these different species that all are different because they live in different habitats. They have different niches or lifestyles. And a couple of minutes ago, I used the word homology and analogy. And so homologs are things like the bones I was talking about. Again, whether we're talking about a human mammal, a mouse that's a mammal, or a bat that's a mammal, every single mammal has the same bones in their body. They may be different shapes, lengths, based on the different habitat of that animal, but they all have homologous structures, meaning structures that are the same. Every one of those have a humerus and a radius and an ulna and all the same wrist and finger bones. But then we also can see examples of analogous structures. Bats are mammals, butterflies are insects, birds are birds, right? And yet all three of these unrelated things evolved the ability to fly as a mechanism for finding food, to avoid being food, finding a niche up in the sky or in the top of a tree that other things can't get to. That helps you survive. Then that evolutionary pressure would have led to flight, but in a lot of different things. And so these would be considered analogous structures because they're not related species, but they all have evolved a similar structure. Now again, in the bird wing and in the bat wing, there are similar bones, whereas in the butterfly, it's a different sort of structure completely. It's more cartilage, and there aren't, pieces of cartilage that are equivalent to a humerus or a finger bone. And so in that case, again, they're analogous structures because they're not anatomically similar. One's feathers, one's got skin, one's got chitin, a totally different material. So homologous structures, where it's basically the exact same structures but in related living things, or analogous structures, a structure that provides a similar purpose, like a wing for flight, but made out of or structured completely differently from each other. Other of this evidence of evolution is the fact that we as humans can actually create what's called a microevolution. I already mentioned the idea that we bred all of these different kinds of dogs from wolves. We've done the same thing with cats. We've done the same thing with a number of different domesticated animals. Example on the screen here are sheep. The fact that we took an ancestor, a wild species, domesticated it, and then started breeding different characteristics together to get all the different varieties of sheep that we have, or cows, or chickens, or goats, or anything. And so again, sort of the idea that if we can do that in the short term, by very specifically and actively trying to breed things in a certain way, that the same thing could happen in macroevolution, nature doing the breeding. It's just that it takes much longer time. Macroevolution, things evolving from single-celled organisms to, octopi and tortoises and flying foxes and humans. But given billions of years, it doesn't seem unreasonable that it could happen on its own when we know we can do it in a condensed time frame by very specifically breeding certain things together. So really, change over time and adapting to the environment you're in is all really about allele frequencies, the frequencies of different alleles in a given population of living things. Another well-studied example of something evolving kind of in front of our eyes deals with these moths. There were these moths like the ones on the left that were kind of salt and pepper looking. They were light colored with dark spots. There was also a similar species that was pretty much solid dark color. And both of those species were existing in the environment. Then as humans became more abundant, in particular places like cities started developing in England, as we started going through the Industrial Revolution, we started burning a lot of coal to power industry, to make machines work for us. Unfortunately, what that caused is a lot of pollution. There were written reports of England, London, in particular, where there were a lot of people, a lot of coal was being burnt in homes and in factories. And people would literally have to go out and sweep or shovel their sidewalks every morning because of all the soot that would build up on it. So we were affecting the environment by putting all this soot, this dark material into it. And that was changing the habitat for these moths. It was making the trees and the habitat, their background, darker colored. And so as time progressed, the darkness of the environment tended to favor the darker colored moth. The ones that were light with dark spots tended to not be as camouflaged as the darker colored peppered moth. Because again, you're solid dark on a solid dark background, it's going to be hard for a bird to see you to want to eat you. But if suddenly you're light colored on a dark background, you're going to be easy prey. And so whereas the allele frequencies were similar for both species prior to the Industrial Revolution, again, you can see the indication there of the allele frequencies as indicated by these population lines. There was overlap in the habitat, right, kind of in the middle there. There was overlap, but both populations were at about the same level. Following the Industrial Revolution, again, the darker colored pepper moth became the more abundant species because of the shift in the actual environment. So again, just another example of the evidence that we've used to continue to support the notion of the process of evolution via natural selection. There's also a very important principle, the Hardy-Weinberg principle, that basically addresses the idea of allele frequencies. Again, within a species, there can be variation within a same species. It's pretty obvious in humans. We've got all different hair colors, eye colors, skin colors, height, body style, all that kind of stuff. But even in a lot of species of animals, there can be subtle differences. The peppered moth having a lighter and a darker version. Species like these rabbits where the more abundant allele frequency are these more typical brown color pattern. But there are also the homozygous recessive allele frequency for creating albinos. If you live in a non sort of wintry environment, you're going to benefit from being brown rather than white, because you're going to stand out. If you're light and you're in a darker environment, you're going to stand out. Now, if you're a snowshoe hare, they have evolved to develop a white color in the winter and a brown color in the summer, so they match their habitat no matter what season it is. But the Hardy-Weinberg principle states that allele frequencies are going to be constant unless something is forcing them to change. So what can happen then is if the environment that a species is in is stable, what's going to happen over time is if this white allele frequency, this white allele pattern doesn't help the species and the environment doesn't change, there's no benefit to being an albino. Over time, the alleles that result in albinism are going to go away. Again, unless the environment happens to be changing. If the environment were to continue evolving to be colder and more snow, more of these white or albino bunnies might actually survive. And what would happen is the opposite of what's showing here. If the environment was getting colder and more snow, then more of these white allele the bunnies that have the frequency that basically is recessive, are going to be the ones that are able to survive and reproduce. Then eventually that would lead to a species probably that was most, if not predominantly, white. But in this scenario where the environment's not snowy, eventually that allele frequency is going to go away. Unless the environment changes, the allele frequency is going to be constant. So again, over time, if there are changes, things are going to change to be suitable to the environment. And so this process then, where the allele frequencies change, is termed genetic drift. So in a population, you can have the elimination of an allele even by just chance, which is basically what this is depicting. So by chance, these recessive allele frequencies are typically going to go away unless something is acting on them. In this case, random chance or environmental change could kick in there. But in each generation, a random set of individuals are going to reproduce. So just by random chance, depending on who reproduces with who, you can lose out on allele frequencies. And so basically this principle was again repeatedly tested, not just with rabbits, but with other species. And repeated testing showed that this was something that was constant, was predictable, depending on things that would happen to the environment or so forth. This kind of leads to build on another concept that's really important ultimately to biodiversity on the planet. And that's the idea of what's called bottlenecking or genetic bottlenecking. Literally think of a bunch of marbles in a bottle, and the opening in the bottle is just big enough for one of those marbles to go through. If you tip the bottle upside down, it's not just going to dump out like it would if it was a glass, right? You put all those beads in the glass and you tip it upside down, they're all going to spill out immediately. But in a bottle, they're going to be much slower to come out. And what that means with respect to a population is that if a population, and it has all these different allele frequencies, just think of these different color marbles as being different allele frequencies. Again, could be different colors or whatever characteristic, but maybe just think of it as color. If something happens that causes the population to create a bottleneck, and that could be something like populations that get eliminated by overhunting or a disease or something, and basically only certain allele frequencies survive. Some of them get eliminated, or again, in this analogy, they get stuck here, which basically leads to them being eliminated. And so when you start off with all these different allele frequencies, and then something bottlenecks the population, and now you only get maybe 2 or 3 of the allele frequencies that survive instead of maybe 5 or 10, whatever it is, you basically now have a surviving population that doesn't represent all of the diversity of the original population. And so what this creates is this founder effect, that even if these individuals now reproduce and become as abundant as they were before, they still are never going to represent all of the diversity, or at least it may take millions of years to try and get back this diversity that they had before the population got bottlenecked. And again, bottlenecking would be, again, you've got all these different populations that are spread out over all kinds of different areas. And then maybe this population gets destroyed because we built a city there. This population gets eliminated because it gets hunted. This population dies off from a disease. So that's what I'm talking about from going from these original populations down to fewer because of a bottleneck like disease, overhunting, habitat destruction. And so even if all of these individuals start reproducing and go back to the original number of individuals or number of populations, they're still not representing the entire diversity that the population once had. And basically that means eliminating allele frequencies. And maybe some of those alleles are not only color, but it could be something like the ability to resist a disease. And if that allele frequency, let's say this red marble, is an allele in the population that allows it to resist some catastrophic disease, and now that is gone in the surviving population, and suddenly that disease hits the population, what might happen? The entire population goes extinct because of it getting bottlenecked. It lost the ability to resist a disease. That's no longer there. And that could result in something as catastrophic as extinction. We also very heavily depend on fossil evidence as evidence for evolution. We find fossils of species that once existed, that we can see from an anatomical standpoint are similar to species that exist today. We maybe find a few in the middle, the intermediate steps to get from an original species to a current species. And that allows us to build the evidence that allows us to understand the evolution of a species like a horse. Now, for this specific example, there are only 4 species depicted from a diverse lineage that has a lot of branches. Some branches go off in a different direction. They didn't lead to the more modern horse. Some of them dead-ended. They started branching off in a different direction and then just went extinct. But eventually, the original fossil that eventually, through dead ends and adaptive radiation, leads to the modern horse. This also sort of is tracking what caused the evolution to occur. Change in climate, going from a more moist tropical climate to a much drier desert type of climate, going from more forested habitat to more open prairie, leading to the evolution of that species. Again, the fossil evidence has a lot of empty spaces. We're constantly looking for fossils that fill in the gaps in between modern species and ancestors to try and understand, to build, the entire family tree. And there are a lot of cases where we'll never find the, some of the ancestors. Just because an animal once existed on this earth doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be preserved. It takes the right conditions, the right kind of climate. And so there are no doubt lots and lots of examples of species. Fossils we'll never find because they don't exist. And so we'll have these big gaps that we have to hypothesize about. And doesn't mean we don't keep looking, but there may be instances where we just don't find evidence or intermediate steps. So there's a link here that you can click on to look at some more examples of comparative anatomy. When we look at the anatomy of 2 living things, we can tell how similar or how closely related they are based on the anatomy. Again, these are all examples of things that are related. They all have the humerus bone, so these bones are all color-coded to show the similar bone across each of these related species. Humans, dogs, and whales are all mammals, of course. The bird, even though it's a much more distant relative, you still see the same anatomy, the same bones. They've just changed a bit to adapt to the species environment, their behavior, their habitat. But because all of these living things have similar appendages, it indicates to science that they also must have common ancestor or ancestors. Again, it doesn't mean that a human evolved from a dog or from a bird or from a whale, or that a bird evolved from a whale or from a dog. It just means that all of these species, going back far enough in time, all evolved from a similar ancestor, where you got branches. Again, some of those branches dead end, some of them kept branching. Bird goes off there, other species keep branching, and eventually you get to the whale or the human. So again, don't confuse the notion of a common ancestor with that something evolved directly from something else, because those are not the same things. We also look for what we call vestigial structures in living things, leftover structures that no longer have a purpose. Humans, for example, have this tailbone, the coccyx. So you trace down our spinal column, and the very, very tip of the bones that are there, get these out of the way for a minute, are the coccyx here at the end of our spinal column. And basically that is a vestigial structure that is the remnants of a tail. Most other mammals, or a lot of other mammals, have an external tail, a tail that's actually sticking out away from the body. In animals like cats, it might be for balance, to help them run or steer. In birds, kind of the same thing. It helps them steer. It's like the rudder on an airplane to help them navigate while they're flying. In us, it doesn't stick outside the body anymore, although there are occasionally babies born with little skin flaps kind of there on their backside. And usually they're just removed. There usually aren't bones attached to them. But this indicates kind of those remnants of structures that we have long since evolved away from. We no longer need those structures or use those structures. Go back to the full screen here. We look at the pelvis in two very distantly related things, humans and snakes. Again, we can find the same bones, the ilium, and then we've got bones that tend to be fused together along the spinal column because they don't fit the same purpose anymore. But even snakes that don't have limbs on the outside of their body like humans do, or other mammals like humans, but snakes still have this sort of spur that is the remnant of a limb that used to exist. Reptiles, most other reptiles, lizards, still have that limb on the outside of their body to walk on. Things like crocodiles and fence lizards, for example. But snakes have evolved a different way to move around, so those external limbs have slowly gone away. And not totally, because again, you can dissect a snake and still find the pelvis, and the only reason to have a pelvis is to attach a leg to it, right? Snake has no purpose in having a pelvis if it isn't to attach a leg to. And it's still there, just it's not quite 100% evolved into nothing, because it just hasn't been long enough since they lost that ability. And then just looking at the legs, the toes of animals like dogs or pigs or horses. They have the same bones, but in many cases they've just evolved to be different. In a horse, it's fused into a hoof. In the pig, it's kind of, two of the toes are a little more fused that make up the cloven two-part hoof, and then those kind of dew claws. In the dog, four of the finger toe joints are still long, and that's what the dog walks on. Maybe the thumb is devolved into that sort of remnant dew claw. It doesn't touch the ground. It doesn't really have a purpose. It just hasn't totally evolved to be gone yet. So looking at all of these vestigial structures, whether they're toes, tails, limbs, you look at seals, right? They've got four limbs, flippers, but then their hind limbs are gone or evolved into being mostly gone, and now they have a more obvious tail that helps, again, propel them through the water. They don't walk on land as much as they swim through the water. So they don't need four limbs to walk on. They need front flippers and a tail to help move them through the water. And again, keep in mind, these are just little pieces of the iceberg that we're looking at. Speaking of icebergs, we also have forms that converge. Again, when you have things like birds or things like fox that live in a climate where it's white much of the time, it's not going to be a benefit to you if you don't blend into your background. So they've evolved plumage that actually does change with the environment. White in the winter time, like both of these, the Arctic fox and the ptarmigan, and then more of a brown or speckled color in the summertime. Both the fox very heavily depends on the ptarmigan for most of its food, and the ptarmigan is mostly a prey species for the fox, so they're very much dependent on each other. These are actually an example of a parallel evolution. Remember, I gave the example of the mountain lion and the deer, but the Arctic fox and the ptarmigan are also species that have evolved together, sort of side by side. Again, the bird and the mammal aren't closely related, but they both converge on a form that helps them survive. And by form, I simply mean color, not like four legs or whatever. So don't confuse convergence of form with convergent evolution exactly. I mean, it's same idea, but again, the convergence is strictly the color that they both have adapted or evolved. Couple other examples besides the what we call a post-caudal tail. We also in humans have a couple other structures that are almost completely gone, but not quite, because we don't need them anymore. At the base of our hair, our hair on our body are erector pili muscles. Either you've had a cat, or especially a kitten, or you've seen them where they're being silly and playing with each other, and sometimes they'll kind of hop up on their side, they'll stand on their toes and go sideways, and their hair will get all poofy, right? The erector pili are the muscles that cause the hair to stand up. And for an animal, it could be a couple of reasons, but basically it's about looking bigger than you are, right? If your body's a certain size, but now your hair all stands up, it makes you look bigger than you are. If you're a possible prey animal and you suddenly look bigger, maybe the predator is going to think twice about wanting to try and take you down. Or if you're two predators and you're just kind of competing with each other, maybe for mates, and you try and look bigger or more menacing, you might be able to avoid a fight, which could cause injury. So just by looking bigger, you might win the fight. Humans have that. Your hair stands on end, right? Just got through Halloween, so maybe you got scared at a haunted house or saw a scary movie and you felt your hair stand up. it's a response to being in a situation where it might benefit you to suddenly look bigger or stronger or something. We don't have nearly as much hair on our body, our whole body, as say a cat does. So those erector pili muscle are still there and they still do what they're supposed to do. We just don't really need them anymore. I already talked about the tail, but also the appendix is basically only something that tends to go bad as opposed to have any value. It's remnant of what an organ or part of the digestive tract called the cecum. And in animals that are plant eaters, they have very large cecum, which are meant to help digest plant material. We more evolved away from a pure plant-based diet. Not that we're strictly meat eaters, but we're a little more like a meat eater than a plant eater, not only because our cecum is almost gone, but we have a relatively short digestive tract compared to something like a cow. We also have a relatively simple digestive tract, just kind of one long tube, as opposed to a cow that has multiple stomachs and a more complex process to go through to break down plant material. Plus, when we eat plant material, it tends to come out not looking as different as it did when it went in, just indicating our bodies aren't set up to be complete herbivores. Now, again, not making an argument here whether you should or shouldn't be a vegetarian. That's not an argument here. It's just that our digestive tracts are not meant to be strictly herbivores or strictly carnivores. We're meant to be a more omnivorous diet, plant and animal-based. But the fact that those organs have devolved over time, but are still sort of there, just like other animals that still have those organs or systems, show the relatedness in the past, common ancestors. We also look at biogeography to understand the relatedness of living things. We have this group of plants called Proteaceae, the proteas, and it's a pretty diverse group of plants that are found all across the southern hemisphere. The area is shown in red on the map there. Before the tectonic plates on the Earth started moving apart more like they are today, there was one big landmass that's shown there in the circle. And so this plant species is again just evidence that there was a common ancestor. And then as those continents started separating apart and becoming totally isolated from each other, and yet we find members of this type of plant family on multiple different places across the planet. Places that are so far apart that it's unlikely that plant could have just gotten there by the wind or something. There's no way the wind is going to blow a seed from South America to Africa. Potentially it could get there via the ocean or via an animal, but just evidence, biogeography, evidence of things that are related, species that evolved from other species as the continents drifted apart. The climates on those different continents changed, causing the plants or animals to evolve differences over time. Again, looking at things like fossil evidence that led to the process of speciation, going from one parent species to a whole bunch of other species over time. Some of them went extinct, and some of them led to the two modern species of elephants we have, the Asian and the African. But along the way, the mammoth, the mastodon, the stegodon, and the other ones there, the ancestors that led to these more modern ones, are all available in the fossil evidence. Putting all those fossils together, drawing these family trees that show relatedness allow us to understand that elephants that we have today evolved from this early ancestor, the Paleomastodon, that lived in Egypt around about 50 or so million years ago. So being able to study speciation, or how we go from one to many species over time. We even, again, see examples of that today with living species. We've got the northern spotted owl that exists from southern Canada through at least the northern part of California, and also the Mexican spotted owl that primarily is in Arizona, New Mexico, the southern Rocky Mountains down into Old Mexico. Genetically, we now know these species are similar, and this gives us then evidence of an example of allopatric speciation, where we have one species that happens to inhabit different geographic areas. They get separated by, a desert and a mountain range. And that one species, as the mountain ranges, grow over time and the desert climate develops, that one species gets separated by these different climate and habitat conditions. And because now you can imagine, if you don't know, the habitat in the Pacific Northwest is pretty different than southern Arizona. And so those different habitats create this allopatric speciation. These two species are still similar enough that they could reproduce and make offspring. They still look similar, they're still genetically similar, but they just don't reproduce anymore because they're separate geographically from each other, compared to what we would call sympatric speciation, where species evolve differences even though they're in the same area. They evolve different types of food items. They evolve different microhabitats. Maybe a species evolves to start living, up near the tops of trees, or the bottoms of trees, or feeding on the ground versus feeding up in a tree. A lot of this occurs via the process called gene flow, when individuals travel from one area to another, and they can join a different population and then introduce alleles into that population. And then depending on whether those alleles are beneficial or not is going to dictate whether or not those alleles actually persist in the population. So if you have two species that have different alleles, different populations of the same species, and those different populations have different alleles, if those populations are geographically close enough to each other that occasionally you get individuals going from one population to the other, and if and only if those individuals breed and those alleles get persistent through genetic, through sexual reproduction, then those allele frequencies can actually move from one population to another. We have a process, I think, that some scientists believe are kind of coming full circle. We probably had one species of owl, whether you want to call it the spotted owl or the barred owl. Remember, we showed the northern spotted and the Mexican spotted owl. Probably just one species, until the Rocky Mountains started growing and those deserts in Southern California and Arizona formed that just forced them apart. We also have another similar species called the barred owl. And the barred owl actually exists more east of the Mississippi River. What's been happening lately is these barred owls on the left here are actually, their populations are growing. Somehow this image got tucked behind here. Sorry about this. Just get rid of this for the moment. So what's been happening is, whereas the spotted owl population had been declining, and it's a protected endangered species, the barred owl population has been growing pretty dramatically. And again, even though the barred owl pretty much was east of the Mississippi, now, because the populations are growing, it's sort of forcing them to move. Too many in one area causes individuals to leave the area looking for their own habitat so they can find enough food and so forth. And so they're actually migrating west. And what's happened is they've now popped up in places like California, where there haven't been barred owls before. And also what's happening is, because again, these are basically the same species, the barred owl is intermixing with the spotted owl, or in some cases even just they're a little bigger, they're more aggressive. They're actually chasing off spotted owls that are nesting and taking over their habitat. They're a little more aggressive. So they're intermixing, and they're even out-competing the spotted owl, which is again a protected species. So biologists are worried that if the barred owl keeps growing, keeps spreading west, they could actually cause the spotted owl to either go extinct or to mix up the gene pool enough that the spotted owl doesn't really exist anymore. The unique genes or alleles that have come in the spotted owl because of it being isolated might get muddied now, mixed up with the barred owl. Now again, keep in mind, there probably was just one owl species that looked, somewhere in the middle of these two, that probably existed across most of North America, if not the U.S. And then because of mountains and deserts, the barred owls got isolated east of the Mississippi. The spotted owls got isolated even kind of west of the Rocky Mountains. But now, climate change, habitat change is causing them to come back together, or more specifically, the barred owl to come back to the spotted owl. And a lot of biologists are finding evidence that it's probably us that are helping the barred owl out. The habitat that we're changing seems to be benefiting the barred owl and actually hurting the spotted owl. So now the question comes up, what the hell do we do with that information? Scientists are wrestling with whether or not they should go in and actually trap or euthanize the barred owls so they don't mess up the spotted owl gene pool, or because they're doing it on their own. It's not like we're bringing barred owls to California. Humans aren't trapping them and bringing them here because they're kind of doing it on their own. Should we just let it happen? It's natural selection happening right in front of our faces. So it brings up another bunch of interesting questions. The honey creepers are another category of birds that illustrate adaptive radiation from one original founder species to a bunch of other really interesting species that have all of these different bill shapes to be able to, utilize all kinds of different food sources. Shapes for poking down certain shaped flowers that have kind of a curve, long curved tubular shape. And then this bird matches the shape of that flower so they can get down there and get at the nectar that's down at the very bottom of the flower. Similar to the Darwin's finches, right? We see all kinds of species of chipmunks that exist in different habitats. I think anybody looking at this would assume these are just two images of the same species of chipmunk. And yet they're different subspecies. There's one that lives higher up in the Grand Canyon, and the other one that lives down closer to the Colorado River. They've evolved to be somewhat different areas. They don't really mix with each other. They're not really that different looking because there's probably not much difference in the look of their environment. Even in California, if you go from the valley floor up to the highest elevation, you'll find a lot of different species of chipmunks that occur in different habitats as you go up, something like 7 or 8 species of chipmunks. They all look really similar. You'd be able to say that's a chipmunk. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some have slightly different patterns, and they probably were one species of chipmunk in the past. And then through adaptive radiation, speciation occurring, they've adapted to all the different habitats that exist from the valley floor, through the brush communities, through the yellow pine forest, to the red fir forest, to the tamarack, lodgepole pine up at the high elevation, all the way up to the highest elevation where there aren't even any trees. Then finally, your book talks about alloploidy, which I think came up briefly in a previous chapter, showing you kind of genetically what's going on, as well as using an example of the a category of fish called cichlids, that you get all of these really similar sympatric speciation in a lake, where you again maybe go from a single population of cichlids that get into a lake over 100 years to having populations that have different shapes, sizes, different food items, and being evidence that this is an example of species being in the early stages of speciation. So, close on some of the misconceptions. I think I've indirectly touched on most of these, but it's a good time to kind of step back. A lot of times people will say, yeah, but evolution's just a theory. And a scientist would say, you're absolutely right. It is a theory. The misconception, I think, typically comes from what is a theory. Now, again, we as a scientist knows that a theory is a bunch of hypotheses that have been tested over and over and over again by a lot of different scientists over dozens or hundreds of years. And we get the results coming back to be similar or the same, to where we feel pretty comfortable that whatever we're testing, the reason is what we're finding out. So we keep coming up with the same results over and over, and those results lead us to believe that this theory is the best explanation. The theory of evolution is currently the best explanation for how things change over time. The problem is a lot of times people confuse the word theory with hypothesis. Now again, as scientists, we know the difference. People don't understand that a hypothesis is just one possible explanation that we're going to test. You test hundreds of those over decades, over and over and over again, you develop a theory. So very different things. It's not understanding the terminology, basically. Another one is that individuals evolve, and that's not the case. Species evolve. Individuals aren't really important to a species. If an individual lives or dies, it doesn't really matter to the species as a whole. What matters is the species exists on into the future, and whatever characteristics help the species survive the best are the ones that generally make it to the next generation. So individuals don't matter, species do. And again, this is something where now you throw in humans, and of course to humans, all individuals matter. We don't like to think about, something like individuals not mattering, because every individual tends to matter to humans, even if it isn't as relevant to the survival of a species. Also, that evolution explains the origin of life, and it really doesn't. It just explains how things change over time. We will never know 100% certain how life began. I believe God created life. Other scientists believe that life was kind of just a random accident that happened because the right things all happened together. And there are lots of other theories on how life began, as well as beliefs on how life began, but we will never know. But again, don't confuse that with the fact that evolution does not explain how life began, just how living things change over time. That organisms evolve on purpose is also not true. Again, we know it's about gene frequencies and whether alleles are carried on from one generation to the next, and random mutations. Things can't evolve just because they want to. A lot of times even scientists use the idea that, well, you know, the polar bear evolved to have white fur. It's not like the polar bear said, damn it, it's so white in this environment and I'm brown. I really wish I had white hair, and concentrate really hard, and one day, you know, you're born, a baby's born that has white hair. Again, it's kind of silly, but a lot of people still have a misconception that it's almost a thought process that living things have. Also, that people say, kind of like with climate change, they use the same argument. Well, not even all scientists believe in climate change, or not even all scientists believe in the theory of evolution. And that's actually not true as well. The evidence that we have is pretty solid from the standpoint of science, and there really isn't much controversy among scientists that evolution is the best theory we have right now that explains evolution. Just like humans are definitely having an impact on our climate. Not the only impact, but a pretty serious one. And that also other theories, if we're going to teach evolution, we should teach other theories like creation, or other things like creation. And again, that goes back to an earlier one. Creationism is an explanation of how life began. Evolution is not an explanation of how life began. So those are not things that are the same. One is science and one is belief. From a religious perspective. And so a lot of times people want to fight those two things in the same conversation, and they fundamentally are different things. But again, they hit us right where we live sometimes, and so we really want to try and support our belief or our theory and try to refute other ones, and we're really arguing apples and oranges, unfortunately. All right, so this is a little setup for the assignment that's related to this chapter. We've got an image of a cetacea, a group of living things, mammals that are aquatic mammals like dolphins and porpoises. And then we have a fish. In this case, happens to be a shark. So read the assignment, but this image is kind of your starting point. Is again, we have a category of a living thing that's a mammal, and we have a category of a living thing that's a fish. Again, distantly related in that they have common ancestors going back far enough in time. But what's different about these two things is that even though they both live in the water 100% of their life, they have different tails. Notice that the shark tail is oriented this way. So when they swim, their tail's going back and forth. Notice on the cetaceans, like the dolphin and the porpoise and the whale, the tail is oriented this way. So when they swim, their tail's doing this. And so the question is, develop a couple of hypotheses that would explain why both of these are aquatic things that and why their tails evolved. Something maybe so simple, but yet different to be just the way they're oriented. All right, so make sure you read the question as I have it in the discussion topic, assignment 8, I believe it is, 8 out of 10, so we're winding down the assignments for the semester as well, and develop 2 original hypotheses to explain the difference. Also, I know you could look it up in Google and look at what others believe are hypotheses, but please just think a little bit and come up with your own, even if it ends up being the same ones, which I assume they will be. Just don't give in and look it up. Think about it a little bit. Think about how or why these species would have evolved, the different orientation of the tail, and again, come up with 2 original hypotheses. All right? On to the next topic next week.